I guess 2005, 2006, I was probably working as a professional gambler with some friends of mine, doing sports betting mostly on the United States stuff. But I've been a soccer fan since like 1998. We didn't have soccer where I grew up, so I kind of came by it very late, and wish that I had learned earlier, but that's not how it worked out. Um, so when the United States changed their gambling laws back in 2007, I went to go work at a place called Pinnacle Sports and ended up running their soccer department not too long after that, because they were refocusing on markets that were not United States focused. So did that. Also launched like the live betting departments, European departments, rebuilt tennis, lots of stuff there. But always a big fan of soccer at that point, and eventually I became a trader for the Premier League for quite a while. And then I got sick at the end of 2012. I had testicular cancer and had surgery and then chemo. And the week that I had chemo was also the first week that I started writing about kind of soccer data from a tactical perspective, and not really looking at it from a job perspective on the gambling side, or I mean, tactical recruitment, whatever. So yeah, then I guess mid 2014 came in contact with Matthew Benham, who owns Brentford and Midtjylland. And I'd done some work looking at recruitment from player stuff, and he was interested in finding a new way for Brentford to work, because he knew that they weren't going to match from like a scouting perspective, like the big networks of, I don't know, Udinese and all the other places. So went to work there for a couple of years and had some success across a number of different elements. Part of my job was obviously recruitment, but another part of it was figuring out kind of tactical edges based on data and looking for different, I'm almost like the future, like what's interesting and how can the game progress. And somebody who doesn't have any sort of prior, I don't want to say knowledge. Like I had a lot of knowledge about soccer, but I didn't grow up in the thing. I didn't learn from any coaches specifically. So I was willing to question a lot of things. And that led to kind of a learning journey. And plenty of times you're reassessing the common wisdom and it's correct. And plenty of other times you're assessing the common wisdom and it's not correct. And that actually is a good way to learn an awful lot of stuff about how the game works. Gambling alongside of that is a pretty big thing too, because if you're wrong about what matters in gambling and you're spending money on it, like you go broke pretty quickly. So at Brentford and Midtjylland, basically put together style of play type documents. How do we want to build like the pillars of our team? And that ends up filtering to the coaches, but also looking like Midtjylland has a great academy. Actually, like one of the best academies sort of per capita in the world. And they produce sort of a Champions League caliber player probably once every 3 or 4 years, despite the fact that the whole country of Denmark has about 7 million people or whatever. So it's pretty impressive what they do there. And so started talking to them about, how might you want to use data? And they were really good at knowing the players that they had and the likely potential of them reaching the first team, and partly what their skill sets were. But you can use data on younger players to figure out what their skill sets are right now and to build development plans for them. Like what is their pathway to build the right set of skills to get into the first team in any particular position, because you then start to know what the first team players are supposed to do. So yeah, I mean, all of that kind of combined in, and that's how I got into this stuff. And that was the end of 2016 is where that took me to.
Perfect. And talk about the edges, and I know there was a story a while back about Liverpool when they were appointing Jurgen Klopp. They had the data guy who had not watched any of the games, but he could tell Jurgen Klopp how unfortunate he'd been in games for Borussia Dortmund the season before. That kind of way you took that model when you were looking at the Brentford approach, and where you could build those edges, or where you could encourage the staff in recruitment terms and also in terms of playing style.
Yeah, sure. You're looking for things that are common among winning teams or teams that are outliers. We quite like Klopp and that style at Brentford as well. And in fact, like Dortmund is one of the pillars that we put together as part of like a style of play guide, that kind of rock and roll Gegen pressing type football. And I think that Brentford probably play that pretty well now, but they had to find a coach to be able to play that. But yeah, it's, Ian Graham and I've talked off and on about their journey and previously our journey, and they've done an amazing job. And a lot of it comes from buy-in. Like, they've been able to actually execute on the things that they learned, which is the thing that most clubs fail at. Like, it doesn't help just to be smarter. You have to actually get the smart things down to the pitch, and they've managed to do that, unlike almost anybody else in football.
And do you think that's a measure of, again, being the people who appointed the right person at the right time? I think, as an Arsenal fan, you've seen a lot of coaches who come in who maybe there's too much dissension between that data point and either the coaches you or the view above him. And at Liverpool, even when Brendan Rodgers was there was probably too much tension between, rather than the harmony there is now.
Yeah, and I think that part of that is also a learning journey as well. Like, I think that plenty of times, Michael Edwards, Ian Graham, their group, they had this estimation of a player, and then the coach would disagree, and he would have his own reasons for that, but that's fine. And what they found was that, like, Ian and Michael tended to be right a lot. But sometimes you only learn that over time, right? So, like, you're having this argument about a thing, and if you have that same argument 2 years in the future, like, that's settled, that's done, that's dusted, it doesn't matter. I think there's also a huge amount of credit to Klopp, and this is something that gets lost in how Liverpool have succeeded. Jurgen, is a very successful manager, and he's also like a very charismatic individual. But to his credit, he was also quite willing to listen to other people and to learn, and in part, like, to let that group choose players for him. To listen to him and what do you need, and then they'll go out and find the best of those players and explain exactly why they're the best and fight for them and buy them. And that's a pretty big deal too. And Jurgen's style has changed too. And coaches don't change style just because. Coaches have to be convinced to change style. And it's hard, like, because you have to get out of your comfort zone and then potentially learn something new or listen to other people who have some expertise in this space and then adapt it into your own system. That's extremely difficult to do. People don't recognize that enough about coaches. And plenty of the professional coaches, like, just don't want to learn anymore, or aren't able to learn, aren't comfortable, don't have the trust level to do that. And Klopp has managed to put all that together, incorporating set pieces from the outside, incorporating a throw-in coach from the outside, looking at the elements of almost their entire style of play as to, is this the best way to go about it, and do we have the personnel to execute it?
Yes, it's even at the youth and academy level, it's a very egocentric position in terms of very fragile ego in these coaches. So to be able to take that on board, I think shows the craft of a true leader. And if you were looking at that from that perspective, when you were in, say, if you went into a club yourself and you were looking to appoint a manager, what would be the measures by which you would try and recruit a manager? Would it be looking at their previous style? Would it be looking at their previous record? Would it be looking at how players specifically have developed under that manager? Again, just Liverpool's point, Salah and Mane weren't performing at the same level they have done at Liverpool. Is that due to the system? Is it due to the manager and his ability to bring out that potential in them?
Quite arguably, Salah was performing at a very similar level at Roma, and they've managed to just continue that on. I mean, that was an underestimation by most other places, and there was this stigma around him that he'd washed out of Chelsea, when in reality, like, he hadn't really gotten enough playing time to wash out, and when he had played, he looked all right. But the other bit there, it's hard to say. Like, the football's complicated, and it deals with people, and how you go about incorporating all the parts is a really big challenge. If I were going into a new club, like, one of the first things you have to look at is your playing squad and what can they do, right? Like, and even if you have a goal of 3 years from now, this is the style that we want to play, you can't just make that happen the first window out. And in many cases, like, if you're lucky, if that was already sort of a style they had, that's great. But plenty of times you need the in-between space and patience to get from plan current to plan optimal future. And if you look at Liverpool, they didn't start out playing like this, and they didn't start out succeeding playing like this. They had to fill in the pieces that they needed to play this style of play successfully, and they added useful things along the way, including the set pieces, including changing a bit of the way that they defend as well. Like this year, they defend a bit differently than they had in the past. Trent makes that a little easier.
You see that continued evolution. I know as an Arsenal fan, what are your thoughts on how that process is looking at the moment in terms of since Arteta came in, and how that's looking like progressing and the time frame needed to get Arsenal back to where they were, 3-4 years ago?
So this was an interesting discussion a few summers ago, and I am an Arteta fan, but I don't know him. I know people who were around the club when he was around as a player, and I know people who quite like him. I know some people behind the scenes at City that were positive. I heard stories about him working with Sterling on his shot locations and helping to develop Raheem as well. And, he existed under Wenger, who at least for a while was a pioneer, but by the end of his career was no longer a pioneer. And then he existed under, arguably the greatest coach in the modern game, which is Pep Guardiola, and learned underneath him, and he was a smart guy. And so there are questions when you have not led a football team as to your ability to make all of those choices, right? And can you delegate, and can you man manage, and can you do all those things when you're on the front line? When Mikel came in, he focused on the defense first, which is the right place to do it, right? Like most teams, your focus has to be defensive first. How do we build the system? How do we build, especially if there's complexity to the counter press triggers and stuff like that? How do we become resilient in defense? And then how do we flow out of that? How do we transition out of that potentially? Like, what do we do in the final third? Stuff like that. And yeah, it's pretty clear that he's done quite a good job at solidifying that defense, despite the fact that, some of the parts are, maybe not quite good enough. And I think that's the right way to do it. But there's this sense among fans, especially and in the media, that a new person can come in and just change a football club. And that almost never happens. Like there's so much there that it is very much a journey. And coaching journeys are the same way, right? Like you don't just immediately know something. You got to go out, you got to teach it, you got to train it. That session didn't go quite right. Like, let me figure out how to adjust that better next time. Like, let me figure out my interventions a little better, my feedback and all that stuff. It's a very complicated thing. And football teams are complicated. They're, 23 players that have different personalities, and this guy's got problems at home, and this guy has he's not sleeping right. So now he's more likely to be fatigued, pick up injuries. Now he's out. I've got to have my backup there. How do we adjust to that? Like it's a constant thing of complexity, and keeping that ticking over is a huge challenge. And nobody is I think particularly magical overall.
When you mentioned he mentioned to you that you'd seen that he worked with Sterling, and Sterling's shot location has improved. And is that something that is measurable when you look at it from perspective? Obviously, players again improve either through age development, but through a specific coach. Is there a coach out there that you would say this is a coach that develops players? Players consistently improve under this coach's management and leadership in terms of on the training field?
It's very difficult to give one individual credit without an awful lot of insight, right? Because you don't, from the outside, we don't know who works with each player individually. Do they work as a unit? Is it like American football? This guy mostly works with the defenders. This guy works with the attackers. He's the striker coach, stuff like that. So without some additional research or insight, it's tough to parse that. But you can take it as a whole. And if a person is coming with basically, 3 or 4 other people that they've worked with together for the last couple of years, and you see that they are, they seem to be successful in developing young players and they bring them through, then you can have at least some feeling that they are likely to continue to do that in the future. If you see them almost never bring players through, despite the fact that they might say that they do in the media, can't think of who does that, then you might not be interested in bringing them to a place where you plan to put a lot of academy players into the first team over the course of the next 5 years.
And if you were looking to support a recruitment process at a club, how involved is still the traditional scouting method, and how involved do they get in terms of development of character and personality and those like intangibles that the data can't show within the club?
So I think that things are changing quite a bit in England, and France is probably like the other one that's pretty close right now. A bit of MLS, but MLS is like a different structure. So, and like England very much is looking at most of the sharper clubs anyway. Can we use data to make our scouts more productive? And you still use the scouts. Scouts are super valuable. Like we don't recommend signing players you have not scouted, some number of times, like 5 to 10 times at a minimum. But you don't have to be in the stadium to scout them. It's a nice bonus if you can, especially for defenders, guys that are like out of shot all the time, goalkeepers as well. You get more contextual information off of them when you're in the stadium. You get more information about shape and rotation and whatever. But in the COVID time, like you basically can't be in a stadium, so like that's particularly challenging too. And so you take all that information, and the one thing that our scouts at Brentford like fed back to us was they're like, actually, I like this because like almost every player that I watch has a potential chance to be in the team. Like it might be good enough, and we don't watch many bad players anymore. And for scouts, that actually is like a nice benefit. Like they feel like they're more likely to have an impact on the future of the team, which gives them an uptick in their work satisfaction. So that's been pretty good. And then the personality stuff is something that I might have not judged strongly enough in the early days, and now like we think that it's something that matters consistently, and we try to find as many touch points on what this player actually is like as we can.
Excellent. And you talked a little bit about that traditional scouting method. Is there anything, I guess, the data hides or that the data can't tell you? Just thinking, positionally, say you're looking for a defensive midfielder. Is there ways that you would see a really, really good defensive midfielder, but they wouldn't necessarily show up in the data as being so, because a lot of it is based on their field positioning rather than they're not intercepting the ball, they're not tackling, they're not blocking, but their positioning is forcing the team to go, backwards rather than coming towards you?
Not with the modern models that you use. Like that's going to be pretty unusual. I mean, it might be that like teams never try to go through a particular player's space, but that's like really hard to do on a football pitch. Like that's, and so defensive midfielder especially, like I think those guys stand out a lot, especially if you need somebody that passes and moves the ball forward. Center backs are trickier because a lot of the stuff they do is off the ball, and that one's probably 70% scouting, 30% stats to try and narrow down your scouting list. Attackers is it's very clear, but you can't tell first touch. You can't tell. You can with like full tracking data, but like that doesn't exist many places. So like you can't take a player from a league far away or like a lesser league and have the full tracking data on that yet. So that's kind of like the gap between what you would like to have and what we will potentially have in the future. Fullbacks do so much in the modern game that they're also really clear. But I think center backs and goalkeepers are still the toughest ones to scout and have like a complete idea of what sort of player those players are. The rest of them, like we're getting, more and more information. When I started out, it was like, what do the key passes look like for attacking players, and basic tackles and interceptions and passing percentages, which we know that not every shot is alike and not every pass is alike either. The different passes further forward are more challenging, longer passes are more challenging. So like, your passing percentage is really a factor of your risk as well as your ability to read the situation and complete the passes. We're a lot further along than we were 7 years ago, but I would say that we still have probably another 5 or 6 years before we get quite comfortable with most of the data. And those positions that I mentioned are still going to be tricky to fully profile just in games, because like you don't have a huge sample of games for every player. So there's always some risk involved.
With the increased use of data, obviously, again, you mentioned here, and we'll be even further along probably in 2 to 5 years. Are there any specific, I guess, trends that you've seen become more prevalent? Obviously, use of edges, you mentioned that manipulating it to be more successful both defensively and offensively. Obviously, expected goals and expected goals against are the two that have exploded into the modern like social media stratosphere and everything. But is there any other trends that you've seen that you think have become really prevalent, both in terms of from a fan perspective and from within the game?
No, I think you've described like most of the stuff that you see on the public side, and that's that's like the bulk of what many of the teams use as well. We're still in progress, and if you're in American baseball and you look at like all the acronyms now versus like even the acronyms that were commonly used 10 years ago, there's a pretty big gap there. Football doesn't have that yet. I think they will probably have that over the coming 5 to 10 years, but football's 20 years behind where baseball was. So.
And if you were looking at a development plan for a player, for an academy coach, you were looking at a forward, a younger 14, 15-year-old Raheem Sterling, as the data person, what would you recommend that coach worked on to help that player develop to that highest level?
Oh, you want highest level? All right. That player needs to scan. And they need to scan even while they're on the ball sometimes. Like they need to get into the box and be able to have their head up and be aware of context in and around that box, right? Because that final pass is the really big one. Like the one that takes you from potentially being 1v1 with the keeper to making that square ball across to your teammate that happens to be closing on the far post and there's nobody near him. And that turns that into about 95%. So like if you want to be at the top level, that's part of it. Awareness both on and off the ball without it. Scanning is a big one. Cover shadows is a big one. Like, do you know what a cover shadow is? And, do you know how to press while closing down a man and being aware of your cover shadow? And that's also scanning. It's just defensive scanning. Footedness is also a big one. And part of that is because it opens up more lines of play for you at any particular point. If you only have one foot, then you can particularly, only receive well on one side of your body. If you have another foot that say like, 70% or 80% is good, then suddenly you take it from, a 90-degree angle when you receive the ball to, maybe a 180-degree angle. And defenders can't overplay this zone because if it goes over here, you're gone. That's a huge one as well. That's like a coaching hack that we talk about. Balance is another one, and balance and sort of explosiveness on the ball with a dribble, like that's kind of the final bit. And I think that though the balance one is maybe like a subtle one, but it can be taught explicitly. The dribbling one is one that people are more and more aware of, and we know that what like the forwards have to be, they need to be pacey, but they need to be able to like create space off of the dribble, even if they can't beat a man for pace. I think that's kind of the set of stuff. Like there are things that get further along, like ball striking and driving a ball accurately when you're further back, or you're a defensive midfielder or center back and need to play out to the wing channels. Like those are pretty big deals. It's very much about the individual you've got and working with the material to nudge them along. But like that awareness thing and that scanning thing are probably the two biggest hacks in the game.
If you were then looking to help support that coach in terms of reviewing and continually updating that, would you look at stats such as progressions with the ball, successful dribbles, number of touches in the box? I guess shot locations would be good ones for players in attacking areas to look at in terms of where they were at a month ago and where they're at in 3 months' time, to review if you're being successful in that development plan for that player.
Yeah, I mean, a month is a pretty short period of time. 3 months is probably pretty good. You're looking at maybe 10 games during that period of time. That's a bit better in terms of sample. But some players, it's just like a switch, right? Like you're like, hey, you're not doing this, you should do this. And like, oh, all right, well, I guess I'll try to do that. But some of it's subtle, like some of it is simple decision making. Some of it is, can I play on the half turn because there's nobody behind me, versus there is someone behind me and I need to just, pass it over this way and get the attack started while not losing the ball. Like all of those things are not obvious, and you can have contextual bits around it, but at the academy level, like you don't have that much good data. So part of it is coaching the points that you should care about, and then looking at the team overall in terms of expected goals and shot locations. Are we doing the things we're supposed to? Another thing we did at Brentford was anytime there was a shot taken, we would freeze the camera as the shot was about to be taken, and have the players look and say, what were the other options at this point, and did they take the best option? And you're starting to teach them about, awareness. Like, I need to be aware of this. And there are times when, your strikers like are selfish and like, I got to score. I don't care who scores a goal. I care that we score the goal, but I don't care like which one of you does. And that actually comes back to things like contractual obligations and stuff like that. You got to change like how you operate. If you operate in like a holistic, I want the team to win and the individuals to succeed, but like, we're going to succeed together.
Yeah, 100%. That's something that we see even at the younger age groups here in a grassroots youth level. Best shoot kid who's the best striker of the ball at 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 will always shoot, even if that's not the best option, and trying to teach those kids that just because you can do it now and be successful in the long term, that's probably not going to be the best option. So what are the other options you had? Using video as much as possible, which obviously isn't as readily available at that level, but trying to help those kids understand that that's one option, but it's not always the best option. It's that a lot, and trying to help our coaches in that term, because coaches just want to win, like you said. So that kid's going to score more than now than he is when he's 17, 18, which isn't really going to help him. If you're looking at scanning and perception, not greatly measurable, I assume, in terms of data, but is there a way to, I guess, ascertain if a player's taking more time in possession? Would that be one way to look at that? Say if they're really holding the ball longer than releasing it because they're less aware of their surroundings, that they have to take part in that process first. Is there a way to measure it? How would you do so, do you think?
I think there's partly there, but like another way you look at it is top down. Like, is the team progressing the ball well? Like when play goes through them, and are they, sometimes players are taking too much risk. Are they losing the ball more when play goes through them? What's the risk reward balance? Like that, those are ways that we can use data to take a look at that. The other ways is just video. Like and when we scout, like, we scout via the video especially, but because we're at a high enough level, like, that stuff becomes pretty transparent. There are plenty of players that don't do this well. It is amazing how many players, even at the top levels, have pretty big holes in their game. And it tells you that, in plenty of cases, the coaches that they've had were okay, but they could be better. Did you succeed because of the coaches? Did you succeed despite the coaches? Like those are not obvious things, and we won't necessarily be able to tell that. But the raw material of being able to succeed against a particular level of competition while also profiling their skill set is a pretty decent way to evaluate their current ability, and then combine that with their age. You probably get the indicator of their potential as well.
You mentioned the players being able to receive one under 180, and I know there's been a lot of tactical talk, especially against since Guardiola came in, about usage of the half space and encouraging players to be appropriate distanced and appropriately spaced across the field in attacking areas to encourage that. I know you mentioned previously that was something that Arsenal did not do very well under Emery, I believe. Is that something that, not data as much as video, but it's something that you can help and encourage your players, just helping them understand, like I said, scanning, perception, ability to receive on the half turn or receive facing forward because they've done that part of the process to be successful as a team. And I think you mentioned also previously that's something that Liverpool did very well. They spaced very well across their front line to create successful opportunities.
That spacing is like training ground stuff, right? And it's easier when there are lines on the pitch, and plenty of the professional groups now have juego de posición lines on their pitch. Some of them have like the shooting rings, especially for younger players. Like that's a way to look at it, because like being able to have visual cues of, oh, like we're all on top of each other in this line or this other line, either vertical or horizontal. Like you can't pass there. It takes one person to screw that up. And that's that you don't want to make it easy. You want to make everything that you do as challenging as possible for the defenders to make the correct decision. The other thing is skipping that half space, right? Like, and when I say, I don't mean the two half spaces that are the channels down the center of the pitch, but like, can I make a pass that skips a whole space between that? So from zone 1 to zone 3, or maybe even zone 2 to zone 5, so that wide space, right? And the reason why is because teams will defend and set up and head up in a particular spot. And now if I can make that sort of skip pass, as you call it in basketball or whatever, if I can make that zonal pass that really shifts the whole bit, now they have to restructure themselves, and they have to restructure correctly while they're doing it. And so teaching players about passing between the different zones and being able to make successful passes, and the triangles that you use, squares on the pitch to say you're in this zone, you're in this zone, you're in this zone. You guys have some freedom within these zones, but we still have to occupy spaces correctly because it makes us harder to defend. And if you're looking to sort of decompress the shape, like you want a shift pass, so somebody over here has to be available. Like all of that works together, but it really starts with teaching them what the right zones are, and then teaching them about their responsibility within a particular zone set.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think that's something that I read very recently, that's something that the Bayern team under Hansi Flick have done very well. That the simplistic instruction was, if someone comes into the next zone, rather than staying in that same zone, to create that spacing and ability to progress the ball through those zones. And back to Liverpool, and I guess my question on this would be, do you see what they're doing in that respect in terms of zone skipping through fullback to fullback and creating those, wide, high lines to be able to progress the ball very quickly from field to field? Is that what you would see now as the next, I guess, evolution in fullback play? And then again, as we continue to progress, there's something else. It's a way to. That was something Liverpool didn't do when Jurgen Klopp first came in.
I think that skill set might be difficult. Like you can't expect all fullbacks to be able to do what they do, especially Trent, right? Like Trent wasn't even a fullback, I don't think. Like he didn't start there. A bit like Benny Henrichs, I think, has a not terribly dissimilar skill set to Trent, and he also started as an attacking midfielder in the Bayer Leverkusen academy. So if you have that ability on your team, then definitely take advantage of it. And it allows their midfielders to be more cautious. So like that's, and in fact, it may demand that their midfielders be more cautious, because if your fullbacks are way up, then how you're destroying things. But like the fullback space is a space that isn't dangerous inherently, especially if you got like some pace in your center backs, because it's wide. And the central space is the most valuable space. So if you're constantly pushing people wide in order to attack against you, you're pushing them into spaces that you can then recover to, hopefully, if you've got some pace in your team as the counterattack happens.
As an Arsenal fan, one of the things I noticed going into the end of the Emery reign, and I mean for the whole first part of the season, that was something that I noticed that was very, very lacking in their team, that recovery. Was it something that I guess was noticeable when you looked at the data in terms of it was just defenders against 6-7 attackers attacking, and the midfield and the forwards were making very limited effort in terms of recovering to support?
Well, we don't have the tracking data on that. You would notice it in the tracking data. My complaints often about Arsenal were twofold. One, they were too clustered when they got into the final third. Their spacing was bad. They were easy to close down with fewer players, especially in wide spaces. And then the other one is that they, in the defensive side, if they got to their own defensive third, you could take the ball to one side, everybody would shift really fast, and then you could just immediately take the ball back to that same side that it came from, and everybody would be over here. Like they were headless chickens in way too many senses. And so if you just forced the shift and then shifted right back, like they would all be out of position, and suddenly these guys would be in a more valuable spot. It drove me nuts. I hated watching that. But I mean, Emery made a lot of choices that made it look like even if he knew what his players wanted to do, he was not communicating well what they were supposed to do to the point that they understood it. And that's something that often gets lost with coaching. Like coaching job is really hard, especially at the top levels. Like you have to have all sorts of different skills that you're not necessarily taught. You need to have some leadership skill. You need to understand how to manage people. You need to communicate and teach. You also need to analyze your opponents, like at a very high level, because you need to understand what they are going to do. You have to build game models. You have to then actually do the coaching work on the pitch, or have somebody that you've delegated to that you can help step in. You have to work with sports science people and medical people. Like, hey, this guy seems like he's in the red zone. Should we play him today? What's the risk? It's a wildly difficult job, and too often, like at the top levels, we don't prepare people for all the hard bits. They kind of end up in that job somehow. And sometimes, it's great. But if you looked at it from the outside, like this is a full university degree that, it has a lot of different elements inside of it. Most coaches don't get to the very top level, but there's still plenty of pedagogy and communication and teaching and man management. Like that stuff never goes away. That's all there. So, those are the things that you have to focus on. And, how much do your coaching badges teach you out of that is an open question.
Back to if you were, let's just say you guys bought a club. Who would be your first hire, your most important hire, and why would that person, how would you select that person?
I'm probably the director of football is what you're looking at. You need somebody that understands the whole picture if you're not running it yourself. And someone who at the top level can execute, but also to force execution downstream. And once you have your director of football, then you set your style of play, and you're then able to have recruitment of the players, but also you recruit the coach that tells you, this is the style we're looking for. This is the list of coaches that play the style, and whichever ones we can get, like that's great. And I've often talked about, if you've got a team, like your biggest worry is not your current coach, it's your next coach. And there's so many unknowns with regard to coaching. It might be one of the most challenging things that you do in football is to go from your current coach to your next coach, because it's a lot of pressure, a lot of trust that has to be involved, and a lot of things where if you're a high level, like sort of Liverpool type team, you have so much information you have to feed that coach, so much about what you want to play. And most of these coaches have not been in these systems, and this information is not disseminated yet. Like football's still very early in this journey. So that in particular creates a lot of challenges. Many times, linguistic challenges are there too. Like there's good coaches in other languages, but do they have all the subtleties and the nuance to be able to communicate in those languages and understand people who are communicating to them as well? It's hard. It's really hard. And that's why, so many football teams are a mess.
If you had some advice to give anyone, or particularly coaches who are wanting to become more proficient or knowledgeable when it comes to the use of data and analysis, what advice would you give them? Where to start and how to go about that process?
So this is where I'm going to plug our course, because we intentionally built this to do this. So StatsBomb last year at the beginning of 2019, we wanted to build like an introduction to football analytics course. And the reason why is because, books are great, but they become very quickly dated, and books don't allow you to use video. And video is an important component in teaching all this stuff about football, because like it's moving. So we're not just teaching nerds about how to use stats. Like we wanted to teach football people across the organization how we, not only use stats to do analysis, but also to find better styles of play. And there's some stuff in there about, which styles we think, look superior via the data, and also an awful lot of examples. And also just a little bit about how the modern sort of clubs view the game itself, and how data has impacted that. So we did that. We went out of our way, and it's about a 4-hour course, 4 or 5 hours. And we tried to make it as cheap as possible too, so that everybody could access it. It's like, I think it's £50 plus VAT or whatever. Normally when we teach that in person, it's 1.5 times that. And it was to answer exactly what you're talking about, which is that I know that there are a lot of coaches that are early on their journey, and it is going to be important for you in the future to understand this stuff. And plenty of it is just understanding better styles of what you want to do on the pitch. If you grew up in England and you watched a lot of like 90s and early 2000s football, that's not great. If your favorite team was a lower team club in England, a lower league club in England, like you probably inherently know a lot about a very bad style, a style that is basically going defunct. And so you need to modernize. You need to find out like what are the better ways to attack. Why do we think crosses are inefficient, even when you have super elite players like Real Madrid a couple of years ago? And so we tried to teach that and to at least give people the building blocks. And we're not the only ones too. There's people out there like Stevie Grieve that have done some online stuff. He's now at Dundee United in the Scottish Premiership. Oliver Gage up at, I think he's in the Canadian Premiership, but he was at Houston as well. So there are other people that are trying to provide this type of information too.
Yeah, we had Stevie on one of our first webinars in the series we did earlier, and Oliver worked at Houston Dynamo before he moved up to Canada, which is where we are based here.
Oh, you're local. Okay. So yeah. Do you work with Tom-san as well?
Yep.
Yeah, cool.
We've set up some presentations with Tom over with the parents down here in Houston, and obviously he does a lot of work with Dynamo. We're actually affiliated with the Dynamo Academy, our club. We work in their foundation phase as well, so a lot of access to what we're doing. They're very, very, very up on this positional play. They use a lot of this methodology and stuff that we're talking about. So it's a really great experience to be part of it here, and it's unusual in US and in MLS to see that even at the academy levels. But it's a great experience, and as I said, I think the course is going to be hugely valuable for people, especially considering the cost of it compared to an in-person one, which has always been more expensive when it comes to travel and accommodation and stuff that a lot of people need. Have you got?
That's the same reason why we have to charge more, right? Because we have to like travel to there, and then we have to stay, and yeah. What was that? I'm sorry, were you asking another question? I missed it.
No, sorry, we kind of got lagged. Yeah, we did the same thing. We did an in-person conference last summer, and the cost of it is just so much more because you have the facilities, people have to have accommodation, travel. So being able to provide online resources to people has been hugely valuable. And I said Stevie, and I've seen Ollie's Coach Tech Soccer stuff as well. So there are resources out there, but I think you guys do a fantastic job. My last question for you, Ted. What are your thoughts on Brentford's chances for the remainder of the season?
They are the second best team in that league, and they don't have the second best results right now. West Brom have outperformed, and credit to them. They're continuing to do quite well. Leeds by far the best team in that league. Maybe a small talent gap with the other two teams that are at the top, but we're getting late. There's only 3 games left. It looks like that's probably locked up. So the Bees are going to the playoffs. They should be small favorites versus everybody else in the playoffs, but you never know. And it's you hate to see it come down to that. It's been awesome to watch though. Like they've been so much fun this year, and it's funny. Like I'm not affiliated with them anymore. Even I think they've turned their squad enough so that there's like 3 players left that we recruited on that squad. Plenty of our players have gone on to the Premier League, but not with Brentford. So, John Egan is up in the Premier League with Sheffield United, and so yeah, I'm rooting for them, but I think they're going to have to do it the hard way, and that's going to be hugely stressful.
Yeah, well, Ted, thank you for taking the time again today. Really appreciate all of this insight and everything you're doing. It's fantastic work. So thank you for taking the time.
Thank you. Cheers. Bye, everybody. Bye.